Hello and welcome. My name is Gabrielle Burt, and with me today is a panel of parents who are joining me in a roundtable discussion on dyspraxia. This group has one thing in common. Each of them is the parent of a child with dyspraxia. This is a roundtable discussion focusing on the parent's perspective.
Hello, my name's Christine and my son is 23.
I'm Alex and our son is 11.
I'm Kath. I'm Tania and my son is 22.
Kia ora, I'm Jackie and my son is 20.
Kia ora tato, I'm Sarah and my son is nearly 12.
Kia ora, we are Ali and Nick and our son is 18.
I'd just like to break the ice with all of you by asking you a general question. I want you to think about this, and I'm going to go round the panel and I'd just like a brief answer from all of you. If your child's childhood was a movie, what genre would it be? I'll just give you a couple of minutes to think about that. Or if somebody has got something on the tip of their tongue, I would love you to start.
Comedy.
Comedy. Thank you, Jackie.
my child he's got a very, very good sense of humour, and he's into acting and and I think we laugh a lot.
Right. Do you think he's got quite a creative side?
Oh, very.
Right. Who's going to be next?
I can probably build on that. Ours would be a fantasy drama, I think.
Love it.
I like that.
Yes. Same sort of thing, very much into the acting and the singing, and away with the fairies most of the time in an imaginary world of his own.
Yes.
I think ours would not be necessarily a genre. It would be Pulp Fiction, a very specific movie. There's a whole lot of vignettes of story that sort of merge and you're not quite sure what's happening, but sometimes in the end you realise that they all match in and they have a part to play. So
Perfect. Sarah, what about Christine, sorry.
Yeah, my feeling is comedy as well, actually. I don't know whether it's because he's a bit older now and we're having much more humour in our conversations and things like that. But yeah, comedy, I think.
Perfect.
I think I'm going to hedge my bets and I'm going to say dramedy. So I think the mixture of the two. There's the highs and the lows. Sometimes it is an emotional roller coaster, but just such a sophisticated sense of humour and almost beyond his years. Just makes me laugh so much, and I get that on his school reports as well. Now I think that's one of the things he's just moved schools that his teachers are really going to miss having that sense of humour in the classroom.
I think that's lovely, and I think there's almost a common theme going through there, isn't there? There's an element of comedy in all of those genres, mixed with a bit more complicated stuff, which would bring me quite nicely to my next question, and that's to do with school and mainstreaming, if they were mainstreamed, and time management. I've got a question here from a lady called Rahini, and she says that how do you stay patient with your child when you've got to remind them every single day what the steps are in order that they can get dressed and get fed and get out the door in time, not to be late for school? And how do you remain patient? You sometimes feel like such a bad mum when you lose your patience quite understandably, and that they're not doing this on purpose, but it's very hard to just maintain that lovely motherly warmth. How do you cope with that? How did you cope with that, or how do you cope with that? Patience.
Don't always remain patient, to be honest with you. We are human.
Sounds normal.
As much as we understand and love our son, there are times when his reluctance or his inability to keep to a timescale has a direct effect on us.
Right.
And trying to cajole him and encourage him can be difficult when you're going past your own deadline. And sometimes you lose your temper. You regret it, and it can end then in in some sort of civil war for a couple of days. But you have to tell yourself sometimes that you do your best you can. Sometimes it's not good enough, but we are human and we have to live with it. I think that's how I view it anyway.
Do you have any tricks that bring it back to where you need it to be, or it's just trial and error?
Yeah, there are some tools that we've learned over the years. Certainly visual tools help, and a very set routine. And once you know what that routine looks like and how long it takes, making sure that you give that advance notice of that routine. So if it takes an hour and a quarter to do whatever is required, then make sure that you've got plenty of time and that you give the heads up and prompts along the way, because they will remember so many things. And in our case, the sequencing got to the point of about 3 things that could be remembered. So he will be able to manage about 3 things and then would require a prompt. So if you can learn the patterns, that's a really good way to help your own management of the situation.
It's certainly about preempting it, because I know our son never likes surprises, and the surprise for him could be, don't forget we've got to go out in half an hour, and he's completely forgotten about that, and all of a sudden he's surprised by it, can't cope with that, feels he's been put under pressure, and then might go off the rails. So we have to gently just remind him continually, don't forget tomorrow morning we've got to be up at 8, and then do it slowly and gradually.
In our case, we also, in our kitchen area, we painted one of the walls with blackboard paint, and we've drawn up a timetable which has the elements of his morning that we want him to do.
Sure.
And you have to sort of know that some days he's not going to do those things, and you sort of got to either know that some days you're going to do some of those pieces and support him a little bit more than other days where he's able to do some of those and have the initiative. So you just know that some of those days, and as Ali said, you got to know that some days you might lose a little bit, a bit more than
So it's more about picking your battles.
Oh, for sure.
Especially at the moment, he's been homeschooled for about the past 9 months now. So there are days when we get no work done, no reason at all. It's just his brain just isn't in it. And I just have to go, okay, we're just not going to do it. We'll go out for a walk, go look for whale's tails, just do something else. But what we've been using is we have a generalised whiteboard upstairs as well. So it has school time, fun time, night time, and also a start and finish box. And so the start and finish box is what needs to be started this week and hopefully finished at the end of the week.
Is that your idea?
That was actually our Ed Sykes idea. And it's been great because I don't know about anyone else's kids, but our one does not know where to start. And that was such a big problem at school because they were just giving him work and he didn't know where to begin.
Right.
So
what about some of you others? What are your thoughts?
Getting out the door in time, I tried to remove distractions. For example, we never had the telly on in the mornings. Right. The other technique I used is I had a backwards clock, which showed red, so you could actually say that, we've got 20 minutes till we need to get out the door. Set it to the 20 minutes and the clock counted down so you could see time disappearing. When he got older, we used the clock on the stove, and again, you could set it to 20 minutes and you could see time disappearing. And then the beeps would be an audible reminder that it was time to leave the house.
Did that help him going forward? Over time, did his timekeeping improve?
No, not really. Now he has to have now as you're preparing to leave, he has to have a shave. He could have done it. He could have done it an hour ago, but it happens in the 2 minutes before you want to leave the house.
Right. Sarah, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you kind of just. I think you end up kind of almost instinctively building in those reminders and those kind of prompts and the kind of like active time management into your daily, like just the way you are, I think, with them. He has a watch. He's had a watch for a couple of years, and that became really a kind of powerful thing, kind of like almost like empowering for him. But then almost sort of became too fixated on the routine. And, you know, we have a calendar, he has his watch, and then he would get stressed if like I was late, or, you know, something that we couldn't control happened, which meant that the kind of the routine then slipped out of sync. And so it's kind of managing the, like a realism around the, you know, sometimes, you know, we set our timetables, we set our routines, but sometimes it's just not possible. And so helping to support the anxiety, I think, that comes around that for my son in particular, that's been, I think, a really interesting kind of just trying to, you know, there's sometimes stuff happens and you just have to roll with the punches, but that's, I think, quite hard, particularly when there is something he is highly motivated to do and he almost becomes fixated on that. Sometimes it's hard to kind of come back from that. I don't know if other people have that experience as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Makes me feel better.
They're all remarkably similar stories, aren't they? Tania, what about your?
I agree with a lot of what Sarah said, in the sense that yes, it's good to have routines, but you can't always keep those routines, and it's about managing that anxiety when you can't. And so, I mean, for me, the early school years, it was about not expecting too much of that morning getting ready thing, and being there to support him. So it might have meant that compared to other parents, I did a little bit more than what other parents did to make sure that we got to the end goal, and also that we didn't have that same level of anxiety, because that could be the real killer. As soon as they tip over into that, you know, where they've lost control of their emotions, it becomes impossible to, you know, to actually achieve what you're trying to achieve. Yeah. So it is that balance, and it is about, at the end of the day, trusting yourself as the parent. And agree with what Nick said. Sometimes you're not perfect, and that, you know, we can fly off the handle too, and that's important. You've got to manage your own anxiety levels as well, because
that's not always easy, is it?
It's not always easy, and you've got to remember that as the parent, you are the backbone, and if you fall down, then what is your child going to do? And so that's kind of, even though there were probably people that witnessed how we were parenting, probably thought, oh, you're babying him or you're doing too much for him, that was important to keep things on an even keel. And then the challenge as they get older is knowing when to sort of step back a bit and letting it happen.
Yes. Just going around the room again, how many of your children were homeschooled and how many went to school, and was it mainstreaming? Can we start with you, Christine?
Yep, mainstream.
Was that successful?
Yep. At primary school, it was actually a small school.
Yep.
Can't remember, but I think about 11 classes.
Yes.
But then into a fairly large intermediate, and then on to a large single-sex boys' school.
Right. Alex and Kath.
He was in primary school mainstream till mid last year, and now he's at Takura at home through some.
And is that working well?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yes, we're able to support and manage his timetables and judge breaks better.
And a level of stress will have gone.
No stress. And what he's learning has gone up. So
that's perfect.
In maths, he was very below, now he's above. So
yeah, that's very good. Tania, what about your son?
Mainstream. He went to a full primary from year 1 to year 8, and then to a large co-ed high school.
And that was successful?
Yes, it worked for him. But,
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jackie?
It had to work quite hard with some of the teachers sometimes, but it did work.
Right. That happens.
Yeah.
Jackie?
So he went to a full primary year 1 to 8. There was probably only 2 teachers at that school that really weren't on board,
Right.
and we really struggled with.
Sure.
The rest of them were fantastic. Then he went to the same school that Christine's son went to, so a single-sex boys' school, and that had some challenges, but he did get some really good stuff out of that. Then he went to Polytech for 6 months, and then he went back to school as an adult student at a co-ed school, and that was fabulous. The best thing he did was it's been brilliant, really, really good.
Excellent. Sarah?
Mainstream school. Excuse me. I have to say that the first few years of school were just confusing in that, here's a child who's, bright and articulate, but can't do these core things that are expected of it. And I think the most empowering thing that happened was actually to get a diagnosis and then to kind of build advocacy around that and figure out, I think as somebody else said, which teachers were on board and which teachers weren't, and how we could actively support that and teach him how to advocate for himself too.
Then that would be a big thing. Ali and Nick.
Yes, I agree with what Sarah's just said wholeheartedly. Our son has had a mixture of both mainstream and special schooling. So he started off in mainstream primary, extremely challenging, and then went to the Wilson School, which is a special school.
Sure.
And that was really successful. Then went back into mainstream again into high school, which was a complete disaster, worse than you can imagine. That resulted in him being actually out of school completely for 12 months and then having to go to the National Health School for one-on-one training teaching. And then he's latterly gone into senior high school, and where the whole environment is very different. And it's been the best thing ever. He's thriving. It's unbelievable.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Right. Now, moving on to the diagnosis. How old was your child when he was diagnosed? And what was your child's reaction to the diagnosis? Can we start with perhaps you, Christine?
Yep.
Can we just go around, unless somebody else wants to?
So his diagnosis came, I was trying to think about this last night, but I think he was 6 or 7. But having said that, there was red flags raised by kindy when he was sort of 3/4, and he was assessed by special ed at that stage, but they decided that there was nothing to it. But then again, when he was year 2 or 3 at primary school, his teachers suggested that I had him assessed again, and yes, got the diagnosis then. I think I was a little bit fortunate in that they didn't send me to just our normal GP or the GP that we normally saw. They actually suggested a specialist, and I went straight to her and got the diagnosis, and then after that I started looking for supports and how I could support.
It was good that you had a teacher that was on board at that time, wasn't it?
Yeah. And as I say, it was a small school, and I think that made a difference in that behaviour was sort of noticed. I mean, they had taught his older brother, so I suspect that it was just a compare and contrast as to learning styles and things like that. I don't know.
So Danny, we got him diagnosed at about 8. He before that there were certainly some signs, obviously. He doesn't have very good eyesight, and so when he was banging into things around the house and tripping over things, we didn't know if it was his eyesight or something else. And one of his teachers, said, look, I think it could be dyspraxia. And we didn't really know what to do with it. She didn't really know what to do with that either. But
did you know what dyspraxia was? Just to
no,
sorry.
we started to look that same day. We started to look what it was, and we found this great Facebook site, and we got in contact with the person who runs that, Jackie, who is actually on here. And I had this wonderful conversation with Jackie, and it was fantastic because she described her son, and it was like listening to my wife describe our son, and it was magical. It left us in a little bit of wet eyes. It was a wonderful moment where we realised this was alike. And Jackie's, I'm raining now on her parade a bit. Sorry, Jackie. She'd been able to get a diagnosis through an OT who just happened to move, who had a specialty in diagnosis, and that person, Emma, had moved up to Auckland only just recently, and we were able to get in and have a wonderful diagnosis through her, and she put together this wonderful report that we still use today as sort of like in any conversation with someone, using a report that actually describes so much of it is useful for us, but it's incredibly useful for anyone who picks it up and wants to understand.
Jackie, can we just jump to you and but how old was your child when he was diagnosed?
He was 6. So like Alex and Kath's son, he had problems with his vision. So he got glasses at 5, and because he would always say that things weren't safe. It's not safe to do that. And so
did he have a reason for that?
No, he would just say, like, riding a bike, this isn't safe, and climbing, this isn't safe. And so, yeah, when he got glasses, we were kind of like, oh, right, that explains all of that. But of course it didn't. And then he he didn't achieve so well in his 6-year-old testing at school, which I didn't even know they did that. But the teacher that was teaching him thought that he had autism, and the team leader of the year said, I think it looks more like dyspraxia, which I'd never heard of. Went home, Googled it, just went tick, 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 tick. And all of those concerns things that I had raised with, with the doctor and with Plunkett and, other health professionals early on, that had been kind of almost, oh, no, that's fine, because he wasn't doing them all of the time. So things that, he could sometimes do things and sometimes he couldn't. So it was kind of put down to, well, that's, he'll just catch up. But looking back, they were all classic signs of dyspraxia. So that diagnosis at 6 was just absolute. Well, it was a bit of a mixed bag, because it was very much a grieving process, because there was this child that I thought I had that was, going to be typically developing, and life was just going to cruise through as it had for his older sister, and, life would just continue as we know it. So there was kind of that grieving process of, I need to change my expectations. I need to change my vision of how this is going to work to best support him. And then kind of once I got through that, the diagnosis was an absolute relief, because it just explained so many things. It explained those things that we'd been so frustrated with, that he had been frustrated with. We now had an answer. And for him as well, it was a huge relief. Even at 6, when we explained, this is why you find things difficult, you could see him just relax and go, oh, right, brilliant. There's a reason for this. And he has embraced that diagnosis. He's never used it as an excuse to say, I can't do that because I have dyspraxia. He's gone, okay, this is going to be a little bit tougher. How do we manage around this? So it's been hugely, hugely empowering. And now he can, he's quite able very often to advocate for himself and say, no, actually for me at the moment, that's not going to work, Mum. We need to do it this way. I go, yep, brilliant. And he's done that really well through school, as well as he's gotten older.
Excellent. It's not an easy road, is it?
No. It's interesting.
Yes. Yes, it would be very interesting, very challenging at times. Sarah, what about your child?
He was diagnosed between 7 and 8, and I think, like a lot of other young people with dyspraxia, he's got several sort of non-neurotypical things going on, and so there's always this kind of the overlaps that happen.
Yes.
And dyspraxia wasn't the first diagnosis that he got, but it kind of opened the door. The kind of the initial diagnosis that he did receive then opened the door to a neuropsychologist. Because sometimes dyspraxia, finding out more about it and saying, actually, I think you should go and sit down with an OT and maybe see if there's something else going on here. That's and then I think that the things that all wrapped up together made then perfect sense. But I think there is that complexity for a lot of people in each of my son's diagnoses are kind of, they're not, there's a spectrum, then each of those spectrums kind of intersects differently. And so for teachers or, people working with children who are non-neurotypical, there isn't a neat box that they fit into. There's all of these things that overlap differently. And so every child presents differently as well. And so there is these huge gaps in knowledge and just capability, I think, full stop, within the mainstream schooling system to support. And his diagnosis came about because I think they kept putting him through reading recovery again and again, and they couldn't understand why reading recovery wasn't working. And in the end, we kind of just said, actually, we need to look into this, and we sort of pushed the school into looking to found out that there was over a year waiting list for an assessment through the local DHB, and ended up going, sod this, we don't want to lose another year, because the cycle restarts every year with the schooling system. You get new class, new teacher, new conversation to start,
and a new list,
and then that then kind of unlocked that series of events that ended up to where we are now, which is a full diagnosis and the ability to have those reports, which are just such an amazing advocacy tool for us and for him.
Thank you. And dyspraxia doesn't always come on its own, does it? It comes with other things. Some children have dyslexia and some other of those conditions.
We've also found that Danny was diagnosed with dyspraxia, and we knew that there was other stuff going on, and in the past 2 years we've had to wait to see a psychiatrist and a psychologist and everything, and we've ended up going privately and paying for it, but they aren't really, they can say he's got he looks like he's got particular parts of ADHD and particular parts of autism, but they're not willing to diagnose that because he's been diagnosed with dyspraxia, and as Sarah was saying, they all intermingle.
Yes. Tania, what was your experience?
6 or 7 was when we got our diagnosis, and like everybody else, for me that was the turning point. Up until then, you're, as a parent, you're, like Jackie said, you've got this idea of how it's all going to work out and it's not, and so you start asking questions. I was very hands-on. I would often go into the class, and my son loved doing story writing, and so I'd look at his story writing in the morning, and he'd be proudly reciting this story, but I could not read any of the writing, and so you start asking questions. And I think for any parent, whether you have a neurotypical child or not, it's about asking questions. It's about being present. It's about trying to understand. I don't think teachers are a very important part in our children's lives, and hats off to them. A lot of them do an amazing job, and when you are parent help and you see all these different levels of ability in a class, it's pretty hard for teachers. And so we as parents, I think, need to understand that even though our child goes to school, we still have a really important part to play in how they, and even more so for our children, because we have to help them navigate the school system. And I think Jackie would probably agree, is that seems to be where our children struggle the most. And I think I just felt that from getting that diagnosis, it was important for me because it helped me with my understanding of what was going on. And from there, I was able to do my own research and figure out what my child needed. Because yes, everybody is affected in a slightly different way, but you know your child and you know what they need and what will be more helpful to them, because and it's trial and error. You can try lots of different things and only end up using half of them. But you and your child will work through that together. And with my child, we never shied away from the diagnosis, and very much like Jackie, it was a part of who my child was, and it was just a matter of finding out what is the best way to do this for you. And we'll work together and find that way.
On that, finding those supports, I would come up with the most elaborate plans of, right, well, we're going to do this, and I would have, visualed and timetabled, and we'll do it like this, and this will be fantastic. And he would come along and go, oh, well, I don't need to do that, and I don't need to do that, and I don't need to do that. And I think often we forget in our enthusiasm to be supportive, we forget to ask the kids, like, okay, what do you need for this to work for you? What do you need to be successful? And after a few times of putting in all of this effort, that he just went, well, actually, that's not going to work for me. I thought, I'm up half the night doing this brilliant stuff that, is out the window. So I think it's really important. And as they get older as well, those needs change. So I think it's kind of being mindful of that, but being prepared to go back. So we have kind of a set of scaffolding stuff that he could bring out in times of stress. So which is usually transition, new school year, things are different. Those automatic things go out the window, and that's when you need to bring that scaffolding back in. But it's kind of, just that intuitive relationship to understand what they need and when they need it, and just, take the lead from them a lot of the time.
Without smothering them. Ellie and Nick, what was your experience? How old was your child and what was his reaction?
So he was 6 when he was diagnosed, and we had the diagnosis first through an educational psychologist. Similar experiences to other people here, in that we wanted to go on the DHB list, but it was a really long list, so we ended up paying privately. And I think the grieving process that was spoken about earlier is very appropriate, because when you can see that there's something not right, and everybody wants their child to be successful and to blossom, and when you see them struggling like that, it does create this huge grief. And we didn't know, whilst we knew something wasn't right, we didn't know what it was, and that was extremely difficult. So when we got the diagnosis from the educational psychologist and the OT, it was a huge relief, because at least we knew what then we were dealing with. And as Tania and Jackie and Sarah all said, you can then go back and you can start researching that and working out what your child needs. And I think Christine touched on having a teacher who could really understand what was going on. And we were very fortunate in that we were all the way along the line. There's been just one or two teachers who've sort of said, actually, I think this might be a problem.
Right.
Like many of the parents here, he has multiple neurodevelopmental issues, which have been subsequently diagnosed at different times. And we've had to work and adapt with that. But that relief, I guess, of knowing what you're dealing with, so that then you can start putting, for us, it was a bit like having a jigsaw with pieces missing. You just couldn't work out where the pieces were. And then all of a sudden the pieces fell into place, and it was like, oh, yes, it makes sense now. And that sense of relief was just so huge. And then we could start doing something constructive. And once you get into the constructive piece, that's when you start seeing the improvement. And I think with a lot of this, and I don't know whether the other parents feel the same way, I think managing your child and how they respond is as much about managing yourself, because your child picks up what you're feeling. And when you're obviously uptight or you're not understanding and what have you, it makes the situation worse. So once you learn that acceptance of what's going on, and you can come to terms with it yourself, and then you can go into constructive mode, it makes a huge difference to your child.
I think it makes you learn a lot about yourself, actually. Obviously, Adam is the only offspring that we have, so he's the only sort of gauge that we have as parents. But obviously, you have a preordained idea in your head of how your child's going to be, how they're going to grow up, with all these things together, dad and son, we're going to do this, and it changes, and it's not what you anticipated, and you have to relearn how you're going to accept it, and it's much about learning about yourself and changing yourself as much to helping our son and coping with helping him cope with his issues. So it's been sometimes quite a steep learning curve, and we're still learning.
It's quite an adjustment all around, isn't it? And this leads me to another question. The expense of the diagnosis. Some of you have had the diagnosis balls, started at a very young age with an on-the-ball teacher sort of thing. But some of you have probably had to go to more trouble, and I've got a comment from a lady called Bex, and she said that she had a lot of trouble. She approached a doctor a year ago that she suspected her child had something. They did speech and therapy and physio, and the school has let her know that the child's struggling and needs support. The physio has done an assessment, but they can't diagnose, and they've had their findings. They think that it's a high chance that this child has got dyspraxia. She has an appointment with a doctor, which is in the future. She's found it very hard to get the diagnosis, and there's also quite a cost involved at times. What have been your experiences in that area?
I worked out a few years ago how much we'd spent.
Don't say it, Jackie. I don't want to know how much it cost.
So he was probably about, 12 or 13, and I worked it out, and then I thought, I'm not doing that again. That is just a horrendous exercise. Between, the initial diagnosis, and then he had occupational therapy every week from the age of 6 until probably about 12 or 13 when he got too tall for the equipment.
Was that all at your expense?
Yeah. He's had speech and language therapy, optometrist, behavioural optometry. The list just goes on. Yeah, so initially, like everyone else, the waiting list on the DHB was just far too long. So he went to an educational psychologist. He'd already had speech and language therapy privately as a preschooler. It was educational psychologist and OT for the diagnosis, and then he had weekly occupational therapy from 6 through to probably about 12-ish.
Can I interrupt you there for a minute? All of these things that he had, were they at your, did you initiate them, or did they follow on one after the other through school and various things?
No.
So it was all hard graft for you?
Yeah, all parent initiated.
Right.
So he had OT, he had went to a behavioural optometrist, he had a private tutor that he had every week from 6 right through to 18, leaving high school. So that was a weekly expense right through. I can't even think what else. Multiple things that are just, the funding just isn't there. It is for some people, in some areas you can access some funding depending on kind of what's going on for your child. I found as well that, you know, it was almost, if he was naughty, if he was behavioural, there would be more funding available, but because he was a cruise under the radar, he wasn't difficult for teachers. So that didn't raise any flags. So you're not going to get any funding because they're not, creating problems at school. So I probably, there's more things that we've taken them to over the years. And then there's, having private one-on-one swimming lessons because of not being able to cope in a group environment. So that's an added expense that you don't have with a typically developing child. It's trying every sport imaginable to see what fits, where that, which we found fencing at high school. And it's not cheap. But it's putting that, those things into finding that thing that works for them, to give them that sense of achievement, and to help them to be physical, to improve those, that coordination, improve all of those skills that you really want them to be working on.
How important is it, in your opinion, for them to be physical? To look after their bodies and muscles.
Absolutely. The more often you do something, the better you get at it. And unfortunately, with dyspraxia, obviously, things can be more difficult for them if they've, depending on whether it's fine motor skills or gross motor skills that are affected. But if you don't use those neural pathways, you're never going to get any better at it. And but often kids with dyspraxia will shy away from that physical stuff because it is so much harder for them. So I think it's kind of, try something. If they gel and they enjoy it and they want to keep going, that is great. If they don't, like we've done, a season of tennis, half a season of tennis, and then, no, that wasn't the thing. Right. So,
who else has had experience in those sorts of things with their children, sports? And
we have we similar thing. We paid for the initial diagnosis, although we did get some assistance then through Marinoto and through the school Senko system, but it was very limited. So we ended up paying for a whole assortment of things, including kinesiology and physiotherapy and visual exercises and occupational therapy, you name it. Riding for the Disabled we went to, which I have to say was just superb. What a wonderful organisation they are.
Right.
So we tried all sorts of things, and in the end we went through the sports things. That was not going to work with Adam, but dancing made a huge difference to his coordination and his ability to control himself. And so dancing and theatre became his, and singing became his thing. But, when you start paying for singing lessons and theatre classes, and again, really not cheap. But I also set up a parent support group at school, and we trialled something called the Fuishan method I don't know whether any of you come across that, but it was developed in Israel by a professor in Israel whose son had difficulties. And it's now incorporated in a lot of teacher training here through the universities. But we trialled that, and wow, what an impact that had in terms of fine motor skills and sequencing. So there were some things that I was able to do myself, but honestly, the time and input I had to have, I went and did reading recovery at school, participated in school class issues. I ran the Feuerstein method classes preschool in the morning. So there was a lot of input required.
Right.
But the difference those things made in terms of that developmental and neurosequencing and the neural pathways was absolutely enormous. And I think the other thing that added to Adam's abilities in terms of his motor skills, and in actual fact, I hate it, and latterly it's been a source of aggravation for us, but computer games. And the motor skills and the concentration and the ability to focus in made a massive difference in developmentally, but of course then becomes an addiction.
So achieving all these things too would actually help to them feeling that they were belonging in their world.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yes. Who else has got some comments on this?
Yeah, so for Daniel was, oh, sorry, Christine. Go for it.
It's all good. It's all good.
Thanks,
look, I was just going to make a couple of comments about swimming lessons, and again, we did individual lessons, but there was some real big advantages about that, in that, for example, he started with breaststroke, which is a much harder stroke, but it's mirrored. It's doing the same action on both sides. So it was actually far easier for him to get that under his belt. We also did the drama in the gym, and again, gym, that was just building up core muscles and things like that. That was really beneficial. And then, of course, we ended up doing driving lessons as well, again paid for by us, but he's there, he's got his restricted license, and he'll be into the full license soon.
Perfect.
There you go, Alex.
That's you raised an interesting point there, saying that he did breaststroke and he did quite well at that, and that's a difficult stroke, but it's a mirror action. Does that have an overlap in any of the other things, and is it just swimming?
I think just sorry, exactly the same experience as Christine and Jackie, that individual swimming lessons, swimming in a large group in a noisy swimming pool, lots of complexity, just awful, horrible. But things like swimming at breaststroke and swimming underwater,
right?
Really, like, absolutely, just suddenly it kind of
opens a new world for them.
It sort of took the kind of dyspraxic layer off. But I think as well, there's so much pressure around sporting achievement, but also the competitiveness. I've just texted my son actually that question, and he's replied back saying he doesn't mind the sport or being active, although it's hard for him and he knows it takes more for him, but it's the competitive element and that
really?
that constant judgment. And I think there's a lot of that. I don't, whether it's particularly for young men as well in New Zealand, but there's an expectation, and it's what a lot of a lot of social stuff is built around at school as well. And so finding your art, your drama, or a kind of the non-competitive sport that kind of works for them, I think is really important. But also
it's the area of success.
Yeah. Finding that which kind of clicks with their identity, and but also keeping on challenging them as well, because like with the swimming, finding the way to kickstart their ability or provide that extra level of support that they need. It's a longer journey. It's kind of just recognizing the journey is longer and it is harder, but there's always
more than
to be had.
But there's more than one way to skin the cat, and that's what they have to do, don't they? They've got to learn a workaround.
Yeah.
I think
Can I just build on something?
Yes,
Seriously.
Tania.
We did the same thing. We did OT, had a tutor and all that sort of thing, and also supplemented it with other things like dancing and, going to a gym. And I agree with what Sarah's saying, is that competitive nature of sport is often hard to overcome. We had a situation where once we finished OT, I was trying to think, well, how can I still keep up the movement side of it? So my child went to a program at the local Y, and it was for 10 to 12-year-olds, I think it was at the time. And it was great because it was fitness. So they did a gym program, a circuit thing, but then they also finished it with a bit of a sports game. And unfortunately, there were a couple of young men in that group, and I refer to them as alpha males, and there was a bit of bullying going on. And so I had that whole battle within myself as I'm sending my son to this environment where he's being bullied. How is that beneficial to him? And so through a lot of work between me and the Y and the tutors and that were running the program, we worked with all the kids, and eventually the outcome was that my son became friends with them.
Bravo, bravo.
Those boys and helping them understand that what they were doing wasn't okay, and that we've all got different levels of ability, and you can help my son get better. And whilst I was agonized, every day when he went there, am I doing the right thing? And it took a while to get to the end point, but the end point was worth it. And that taught my son valuable things as well. Yes. As well as the other boys that were being the bullies. And so that's also, I think, a challenge that our kids, they are a target, but we can't shelter them from that. We have to work our way through it.
Yes, you do.
Yeah. I was just going to say that individual sport was what we worked out really quite early on, that in a team environment, he was most likely going to be the weakest link in the team. So we very quickly found that individual sport, where he was comparing his own progress just to himself. So rock climbing and fencing in particular, those are the two things that really kind of stuck with him, where he wasn't letting anyone else down, and he was just doing his own thing, but in a group environment. I think sometimes the team sports is often the breeder of that kind of massively competitive situation.
I've got another question for you. Do you think that the cost of the diagnosis, and I'm taking into account all the sports and the creative pursuits and everything that you've had to, as well as the OT things and the physios and the doctors, do you think that and this is probably aimed more at the parents of the older children who are not children now, they're adults, do you think the cost and the difficulty was more then when your children were small, or what's your take on it?
I think there's less, there seems to be less people around for assessment and diagnosis. So there seems to be less educational psychologists and less occupational therapists that are out today. Yeah.
Really?
That's kind of my feeling on it. I think we had a really smooth diagnosis process, it just seems to be a lot harder to get the right people together to do the diagnosis.
Right.
Certainly at the moment, what we've seen in the last couple of years is that potentially with things like COVID, there's been greater stresses on the system as well from things like anxiety and stresses that have caused some of those services to be overwhelmed. So to get, we try to get in front of a psychiatrist and to get some anti-anxiety medication. And it was over a year to get into the sooner, the earliest appointment was over 12 months to get to. You can see it like it was, 11 months sort of, these are long journey points once you, to get to even an appointment. So I think these days, just the amount of people trying to hit the system is greater.
Right. Anyone else got any comments on that?
I do. Well, I would like to think that maybe more teachers are aware of what dyspraxia is.
Yes.
Than what it was back when my child was being diagnosed. But one thing I would like to say, which is slightly different, is that whilst it has been expensive and we have made a lot of sacrifices, I don't regret it for 1 minute. When I look at my son now, I am so proud of him, and he's self-sufficient. He's been flatting for 2 years. Unfortunately, he's about to come home because he now realises that's the best way to save money. But I would do it all again in a heartbeat.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I agree entirely.
Yes.
And all over again for the difference that it's made to him and the opportunities that it's given him.
And I just feel a bit sad for those families out there that aren't in a position to make the sacrifices that we did, because it's pretty tough.
I was just going to say that from when I looked at it, not every family has got the capability to invest huge amounts of money, and sometimes you have to rely on the system. But one of the things I found, and it was quite uncomfortable, but it just had to be, you have to become quite pushy. Nobody else is going to advocate for your child. And the more you push, the more you get. He who shouts loudest. And I know that sounds a terrible thing and it shouldn't be like that, but the reality is it is. So as a parent, especially parents of younger children now, if you think there's a problem, shout to everybody and anybody you can, and somebody will pick up on it. But if you keep quiet and just wait for the system, you'll wait forever.
There is no established route to take either. You have to do so much investigation of your own, find out anything, any societies out there which might help. You can't just open up. You can't just go on the internet and go, my son has dyspraxia, and it goes, well, you do this, you do this, you do this. You go to them. You have to investigate it all for yourself. And from listening to everyone speaking here, we've all, had found out different little things that we can do to help our child. But I think it demonstrates the fact that there is no route to take. You have to find your own route, and that.
We also found for us that you also don't necessarily listen to one person, and if they say that there's a roadblock there, that you have to accept that. So for one of our teachers in the Senko, they said there were no computers available for our child to have one-on-one, and we pushed it up to the principal, and he said, actually, I've got some budget set aside in our budget for technology that's been underused, so I'm happy to buy a laptop. And the teachers in the Senko themselves had just not asked the principal. And if we'd taken that, we would have not got the computer, but we push. That's not saying it's the same everywhere, but that's just an example of, you find some surface level pushback, and that's where you're the shout. You got to push harder, and he who yells the loudest, whatever that metaphor that you use so eloquently comes into play.
Unfortunately, I think, you find yourself becoming an expert in the area. and often you find yourself knowing more than that classroom teacher, even sometimes more than the SENCO. You become very au fait with the Ministry of Education guidelines around what you are entitled to and what best practice looks like for supporting a child like yours. And, you know, it shouldn't be the case that the parent is the person in the room advocating for an IEP, for example, individual education plan. But, you know, our experience is that often that's been the case. And kind of just raising expectations around the way that young people with dyspraxia and other other neurodiverse identities are kind of treated, and within the formal education system there are gaps, and you do, you know, with support people like Jackie, etc., you do find yourself on an extremely steep learning curve, and then trying to pay it forward as well.
So each of you really have had to employ the tactic of being a fierce parent at times, haven't you, to get what your child who needs at a time when they haven't got a voice. Some of your children now are very comfortable in their own shoes, which is a testament to them and to your parenting. Just sort of along that same track, I'd like to just explore the emotional obstacles that you and your children have, you know, sort of met together, and the difference that there might be with these at different ages. So what have been the most difficult aspects of life for you and your child thus far? And if we could just start with Alex and Kath, and we'll just work around the room. You're on. Or if somebody else would like to start.
No, absolutely. We're just taking a moment, because when it comes to the emotional side of this journey, this is, you know, it can be pretty tricky. Our son, obviously, at 11, has just sort of entered a different hormonal and journey point, and sometimes it's hard to see where the difference between some areas are. And, you know, we have, you know, I find myself quite different to my son in terms of he needs timetabling and schedules and, you know, understanding what's going to happen on a day. And I'm the complete opposite. I love to be ad hoc and adventurous and go out, and, you know, and we have certainly clashed over the past with that. And, you know, I think, you know, the emotional impact of setbacks, because there's always setbacks on this journey, and then what that means to you when you think you've got past a certain point and you're like, yes, we've got this, the scaffolding's worked well, great, and then it descends back into a different area. It can be quite an emotional journey, quite impactful. And fortunately for us, we've got a partnership between us, which is we're able to support each other on that.
Right.
And you know when to step out of the room or when to step into the room when the other one needs it. Well, Kath steps into the room a lot and I step out.
Go, Kath. Fair enough.
I think past years have been quite emotionally impactful as well. Anyway, I mean, we've been going through a full-on journey with everything with Danny, and then of course on top of that there's been COVID, and then on top of that we had the other two children at home, so we've all been locked down together for what seems like an eternity at times. So it's been a learning curve.
Because there's certainly impacts on the siblings as well, of children with dyspraxia, and I think sometimes for us we found, I found myself spending too much time looking at those things and not necessarily the balanced family overall existence as well, and you've got to take some of that into play.
It would be easy to be sidetracked, wouldn't it? And at the expense of your other children.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I even forget how many other children we have these days. It's hard to know.
Tania, what's your experience of this? Emotional obstacles, and how, you know, are they different for different ages? And what have been the most difficult aspects for you?
I think for me, the most difficult time was probably it's a toss-up between the teenage years and 8 to 12, really. I think the aspect, though, was when he would get frustrated and we would have he was the perfect child at school, and he would spend all his energy being really good at school, and then we'd come home and and trying hard not to take that personally. But also, and I always used to say, it's often hard to pick what is bad behaviour because of just bad behaviour, and you setting your limits and saying, no, I'm not going to accept that behaviour, or what is dyspraxic behaviour. And often they would tip into each other, and that was a real challenge. And trying to, we had certain things that we wouldn't accept happening in our household, and if that happened, there had to be consequences for that. But also, not using dyspraxia as an excuse to have that bad behaviour. So that was always a really, really, hard challenge. And if he would get into a full-blown tantrum, understanding that he didn't have the skills to get out of that. He wasn't just being bad, he had got to a point where he couldn't pull it back on his own, and I had to try and help him do that. So that was probably, and then, the whole teenage thing, and he very much wanted to be like everybody else. Didn't want to go to the learning support centre at high school because he was okay. And at some point, I had to step back from that and say, well, that's more important at this stage for him to be socially accepted, and him to feel that he's socially accepted. We'll step up and we'll give him more support at home, so that he will get through. But it was frustrating, and sometimes as an adult you've got to put your own preferences to the side and think about, okay, if that's what's going to work for my son, then we will run with that.
And it would be very difficult at times not to give him the benefit of the doubt because he had dyspraxia.
Yeah, very, very difficult. But then I think that's when, and probably sometimes I look back on it and think, maybe I was a bit too tough. Maybe my expectations were too high. But I would like to think that he would be. He probably did think that, but I think he appreciates that now because he knows that was in his best interest.
I think for us, it's been it's an emotional roller coaster right from the word go. And initially, before he was diagnosed, we just thought we had a naughty boy, and that was worrying. We thought, reflecting on our parentage, and a lot of our friends and my siblings particularly were handing down all sorts of advice of what we shouldn't be doing, and we felt really inadequate. When he was
that's really hard when people do that. How did you cope with that?
We didn't. It didn't cope. It was hard on us because we were picking faults with each other. Well, you're too soft with him, or you're too hard with him.
You always give in.
Yeah, it was bad for us. So when he was diagnosed, it was manna from heaven. It was a wonderful feeling that he was diagnosed. It's a huge relief. We then felt that we had somewhere we could go. We could move forward. We could actually handle this now. We could find solutions. It wasn't us. It was a problem with our son. So there was a roller coaster of emotions then. Latterly, in his teen years, there has been friction between him and me because in some respects we're very alike. In some respects we're like chalk and cheese. But it was touched on before. It's like, you need to take them out of their comfort zone, because it's not all about just pandering to what they feel comfortable with, because they're not going to grow, they're not going to experience the stresses of life once they've left home. And for me, it's always been difficult drawing a line between allowing them their issues because they have difficulties, but driving them beyond that to try and educate them that life's just not going to happen for them all the time. There is some self-discovery. There is stuff that they're going to have to find out for themselves, and it's almost every day you have to let go a little bit and see how they cope with it. And latterly, just the other day, he came back from school absolutely pumped because he himself had decided that he needed to do something about improving his grades and his points. He went to speak to his tutor, and I can't remember what he did at school now, but he came back with 8 extra points. He'd all done on his own that day. And it was such a brilliant feeling because we then can see he is trying
Taking
to
responsibility.
be the architect of his own future. And it's just every little day now. Every day something little happens that just makes you feel, oh, we're on the road to success here. But again, it's just an emotional roller coaster. But
celebrating those successes is so important.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Celebrating the successes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Someone said to me,
all the
sorry, go on.
Go on, Ellie, finish what you were saying.
I was just going to say, someone said to me, you know what, you've got to make the good bits last while they can, because it'll always dip again. So make the most of the good while it's happening and really celebrate that, and then deal with the rest as it comes.
Yeah, for me, before Alex was diagnosed, it was very much, it's not my parenting. I've got this other typically developing child over here who is brilliant and is doing all these really cool things and is the perfect model child. So it's not my parenting. I have no explanation for this one. I don't know what happened there. But then when you get the diagnosis, it's like, oh, okay, right, this kind of makes sense now. And I think, kind of with him, sort of his emotional state, a lot of it was tied in with his rigidity. So that, that inability to cope with things changing, which can still be a problem now, although he insisted it isn't. I can still see we have some conversations that are very much around, things changing, and he's still got that rigid thought process. But I think as well, I've always apologized to him if we've had an emotional situation and I haven't dealt with it well. I will apologize not so much for my emotions, but for how I've dealt with it. Right. And now as an adult, he will apologize to me. So if he's been under stress and he has, responded in quite an emotional way, and then realizes later, he will actually now apologize to me. It's quite often not face to face. It'll quite often just be a text saying, hey, I overreacted. Sorry about that. So I think, giving them that example of recognizing that your behavior wasn't perhaps as good as it could have been is another set of tools that helps them as adults recognize, oh, okay, yeah, I could have done better in that situation. And realizing that your impact on other people, which when they're little, you don't see that. So you just have to kind of keep plugging away at that and doing those things, those behaviors that you want them to exhibit as adults, because it does happen in the end. You might not think it when they're, 8, 9, certainly not as teenagers, but it does come back in their 20s.
That's handy, Jackie. You've just given me, it's very exciting to know I've only got to wait another decade before I get into politics. That's good.
Absolutely. You're on the road. It's all good. It's all good.
You're giving us hope, Jackie. That's awesome. Thank you.
For our son, there's it's just that stimuli of the social environment, especially even if there's a crowd. The worst we've had it was a couple of years ago, we were in New York City at Christmas time, and just the amount of people that were around, basically he completely shut down, and most of his limbs basically stopped working, and we had to sort of carry him around really, because it's just so much stimuli. And so going back to other social situations, there's just a nervousness about, are people watching me? Is there, what might happen in this situation? And a lot of that we found, the more we were able to give them information ahead of time, the more we might have a plan B or something to look forward to afterwards. We're going to be here for a certain amount of time, but after that, we're going to be doing this. That's going to give you time to decompress. Helped, but there's definitely an overstimulation that can happen.
Right. Can you?
So my son's the opposite. He would love to be in New York City at Christmas in a crowd. He is sensory seeking and all of that stuff. He just loves it.
Right. Has anybody else got anything to add to that?
Socially speaking, that was one of the things when our child was young, when we thought, oh, is he going to make friends? How's it all going to work? But actually, he doesn't have any issues, making friends. He was involved in a lot of music groups going through school.
Right.
He's a drummer, so coolness factor. So I think that opened a whole lot of doors for him to make friends that had, similar interests, and so he never really struggled with the social thing. But I do get the overstimulation. We did have an overseas trip one year, and everybody was looking forward to it, and our son was going to go out and do this, that, and the other thing, but the reality of actually being there, the first night, he just couldn't cope with it. He had to stay in the hotel room, and as a family, we could have got really annoyed and upset because he was, interfering with our plan of how it was going to be, but having that understanding that he just needed that extra time to adapt, to the new environment, just meant that we said, yep, fine, stay in the room, we'll go off and do our thing. And so a lot of what you have to do with as a family is adapt to what everybody's needs are, really.
So everybody has to move a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. Have you got anything that you can contribute to that, Sarah?
I think everybody else really summed it up.
Okay.
There's a lot of familiarity, although I think just a big emotional factor for us was just the amount of time and frustration was spent trying to navigate the system and trying to get the best results for our child from school, from all of the other kind of systems that you end up engaging with, and finding just the sheer frustration and time and energy, and having to put your kind of fighting trousers on to engage when that's not necessarily your style or your preferred way of doing things, and that takes a lot as well.
Thank you. Has anybody else got anything to contribute? Yes, Jackie.
Oh no, sorry, I was just
waiting. Hello there. Well, I've got, if you could just all think about this for a moment. First of all, I'd like to thank you all very much for your participation in this today. It's been very, very informative, and I've really enjoyed speaking with you and listening to what you have to say. But I would just like you to put on your thinking hats one more time. If you were to write a postcard today to be delivered to yourself just before your child was born, what would you say? One sentence only. So that's a postcard today written to you just before your child was born, your dyspraxic child. What would you say? Who would like to go first?
I'm going to go first.
Perfect.
Don't sweat the small stuff.
Very good advice.
Oh, good one.
Very good advice.
I think I'd say actually success doesn't look like what you think it looks like.
Very, very good.
I'd say this is a hidden gift. Find the gifts and make the most of them.
Lovely.
I'd say probably trust your instincts, and he's going to be awesome.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'd say hold on. This is going to be a journey, but as a family, it will make you stronger.
That's me, is it?
That's you, Tania. All eyes on Tania.
I know. It's going to be a wild ride, but the end is going to be worth it.
That's lovely. That all made me just about cry. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much for your honesty and your sharing. And I'm sure that the people who watch this documentary and video, will learn a lot from people like you who have been through so much and have come out with such beautiful children and adults, and have had such lovely advice to pass on. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you all.
Yeah, nice to see everybody.